April 12, 1945. The heart of the Third Reich is beating its final ragged pulse. General George S. Patton, Jr., the old blood and guts of the U.S. Third Army, is driving his armored divisions into a wasteland of ruins and desperation. But as the iron grip of the Wehrmacht fails, a new, treacherous shadow emerges from the smoke, one that would force a legendary commander into a decision that changed the very nature of the battlefield. Why did the symbol of surrender become a death sentence? And what was the secret cost of Patton's tactical pivot? The spring of 1945 was not a season of rebirth for Germany. It was a season of fire and stone. As the Allied forces crossed the Rhine and penetrated the German interior, the traditional boundaries of combat began to dissolve into a chaotic, irregular landscape. General George S. Patton, a man who lived by the sword and the swiftness of the horse, now found himself commanding a mechanical titan that was being bled by a phantom enemy. The German Wehrmacht, once a disciplined monolith of maneuver, had fragmented into desperate pockets and fortresses commanded by a regime that increasingly prioritized ideological suicide over military reality. The tactical environment Patton faced in these final weeks defied everything in the training manuals. As the Third Army exploited the German disarray to prevent the consolidation of a national redoubt in the Alpine regions, the disappearance of trust became as much a weapon as the Panzerfaust. American soldiers, having fought from the hedgerows of Normandy to the snows of the Ardennes, were suddenly confronted with a threat they had not been trained for: the systematic weaponization of the white flag. In the ruins of German cities like Aschaffenburg and Mannheim, the ancient symbol of truce was transformed into a lethal bait. German snipers and anti-tank teams, often integrated into civilian neighborhoods, began hanging white sheets from windows to lure American infantry into vulnerable kill zones. It was a calculated act of perfidy, a betrayal of the most basic laws of war defined in the legal abstractions of the time. For Patton, the strategic enigma was clear. How do you maintain the momentum of an army when the very signals of surrender are being used to gut your vanguard? This tactical betrayal necessitated a fundamental shift in engagement rules, leading to a period of increased violence that redefined the nature of the 1945 battlefield. Patton's response was not born of hesitation, but of a cold, operational necessity that redefined the 1945 battlefield. He recognized that the traditional room-to-room clearing of buildings was becoming an unacceptable risk to American lives. He would not trade the blood of his men for the structural integrity of a sniper's nest. The directive was issued: a fundamental shift in engagement rules. This was the birth of a doctrine that would haunt the post-war era: a total reliance on overwhelming suppressive force. Patton, often seen leading from the front in his specially modified Dodge WC-57 command car, outfitted with a .50 caliber machine gun and 2 air horns, demanded that his divisions adopt a fire-first, ask-questions-later mentality to maintain the relentless offensive speed that had defined the Third Army since the breakout at Avranches. The centerpiece of this new aggression was a tactic known as reconnaissance by fire. In earlier campaigns, such as the North African Desert in 1943, Patton had seen this method used against his own men during the disastrous Valentine's Day offensive near Sidi Bouzid. There, the veteran units of the Africa Corps had shelled positions where Americans might be concealed, provoking a return fire that revealed the green U.S. 2 Corps positions and caused widespread panic. Now, in the urban canyons of the collapsing Reich, Patton turned the lesson on its creators. He equipped his mechanized cavalry and armored divisions with the tools to implement the tactic on a massive scale. The .50 caliber machine gun proved particularly effective in flushing out German teams waiting in ambush. In the final drive through Germany, the speed of the advance forced Patton's units to rely heavily on this fire-first approach to maintain momentum and bypass pockets of die-hard SS resistance. The mechanics of this tactical evolution were brutal and efficient. As a task force from the 4th Armored Division approached a German village, they no longer waited to be fired upon. If the silence of a town felt suspicious, or if a white flag fluttered from a church steeple that provided a clear field of fire, the tanks would open up. They utilized heavy machine guns, primarily the M2 Browning, to rake wood lines and windows. If a structure was suspected of harboring a Panzerfaust team, it was engaged with high explosive or white phosphorus shells, regardless of the flags displayed. This was not about cruelty. It was about the cold logic of survival in a theater where trust had been systematically murdered by the enemy's own desperation. This tactic effectively broke the German wait and trap strategy, but at the cost of significantly increased collateral damage and a total breakdown in the trust between the advancing army and the civilian population. Unit diaries from the 19th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron reveal the granular reality of this shift. In mid-March 1945, as the squadron approached the towns of Thom and Augsburg, they found themselves in a landscape bedecked with white. But the veterans of Patton's Ghost Corps knew better than to trust a bedsheet. They entered these towns with reconnaissance by fire, their M8 armored cars and light tanks raking the windows with machine gun fire as they advanced. In Thom, the town was empty, the enemy having fled. But the protocol remained. The white flag was no longer a guarantee of safety. It was merely an invitation for a more cautious and often more violent American entry. Patton's philosophy was clear. The lives of his soldiers outweighed the sanctity of a flag that had been tarnished by the SS. This pattern was repeated in towns like Herla Niederbrumbach, where the squadron observed white flags but entered with guns blazing to ensure no ambushes remained. However, the nature of the battlefield in 1945 was a study in contradictions. For every act of perfidy, there was an instance of professional military conduct that seemed to belong to a different century. One of the most significant leadership dilemmas for Patton involved the surrender of the German 11th Panzer Division, the famed Ghost Division. Under the command of General von Wiedersheim, the 11th Panzer had been withdrawing into the Sudetenland, desperately trying to avoid the advancing Soviet Red Army to surrender to the Western Allies. Von Wiedersheim was a professional soldier who had established a rapport with American units, such as the 2nd Cavalry Group, during the fighting in Lorraine in 1944. This rapport was built on small acts of battlefield chivalry, such as the exchange of seriously wounded prisoners. Von Wiedersheim sent emissaries under a genuine white flag to negotiate terms. Patton, the old horse cavalryman, faced a massive gamble. Allowing a fully armed and capable enemy division to surrender in style was a direct departure from the unconditional surrender policy dictated from Washington. But Patton saw a second-order insight. By accepting this professional capitulation, he could secure the German-Czech border without a prolonged and bloody battle, consolidating gains that would be vital in the coming Cold War. He authorized Colonel Charles Hank Reed to facilitate the surrender, demonstrating that when honor was maintained between professionals, the nature of the battlefield could remain structured even during a total collapse. This act of consolidating gains allowed the Third Army to secure the border region effectively, proving that trust could still function as a strategic asset. This act of consolidated trust stood in stark contrast to the scorched earth tactics occurring elsewhere. It proved that trust, while a luxury, could still function as a strategic asset. But while Patton negotiated with Panzer generals, his eyes and ears, the 2nd Cavalry Group, were about to embark on a mission that blurred the lines between military objective and cultural preservation. This was Operation Cowboy. On April 26, 1945, a Luftwaffe officer named Colonel Walter Holders approached American lines in a black Mercedes, waving a white flag. He didn't come to surrender himself. He came to plead for the lives of the Lipizzaner horses, the prized white stallions of the Spanish riding school in Vienna. The horses had been seized by the Nazis for a bizarre livestock breeding program aimed at creating an Aryan horse. Now they were being held at a stud farm in hostile Czechoslovakia, directly in the path of a hungry Soviet army that had already been known to slaughter priceless horses for meat. Patton's response to the request was succinct and legendary. Get them. Make it fast. It was a classic Patton move, diverting combat resources for a mission of high sentiment and strategic value, even as the war reached its bloody crescendo. The operation involved a task force of 300 men, supported by M5 Stuart light tanks and armored cars, penetrating 20 miles behind German lines into territory theoretically still controlled by the SS. The rescue required a multinational task force of 300 men, supported by M5 Stuart light tanks and armored cars. They had to penetrate 20 miles behind German lines into territory theoretically controlled by the SS. The tension was palpable. The Americans were a tiny island in a sea of retreating yet still lethal German troops. When they reached the stud farm on April 28th, the German officers surrendered as promised, marching down the street holding a white bedsheet. The primary objective was the rescue of the Lipizzaner broodmares and Allied POWs, who were also being held at the stud. But the most extraordinary turn of events was yet to come, a moment that would test the very limits of battlefield alliances in the closing hours of the war. As a die-hard SS unit launched a counterattack to reclaim the farm, the American GIs found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder with their newly surrendered German counterparts. Allied and Wehrmacht soldiers, enemies just hours prior, now fought a common foe to protect a sliver of culture from destruction. It was a moment of profound humanity in a campaign that was otherwise descending into darkness. This operation highlights a unique insight into Patton's leadership. He was willing to divert combat resources for cultural objectives if it served the strategic goal of stabilizing the rear area. But that darkness was about to be revealed in its most grotesque form, changing Patton and his men forever. As the Third Army pushed toward Bavaria, they stumbled upon the concentration camp system. When Patton, Eisenhower, and Bradley visited the Ohrdruf camp on April 12th, they were confronted with the physical evidence of the regime's human depravity. Patton, a man who had seen years of slaughter, was famously revolted, later ordering the citizens of the nearby town to tour the camp to witness the crimes committed in their name. This exposure provided a grim moral context for the aggressive reconnaissance by fire tactics. The loss of trust was no longer just about snipers. It was a fundamental rejection of the Nazi state as a civilized adversary. The realization that the enemy was responsible for such degradation solidified the American resolve to achieve total victory. The discovery of the camps, particularly Dachau on April 29th, eroded any remaining good faith toward the surrendering German forces. When the 45th Infantry Division liberated the camp, the shock and anger felt by the soldiers further eroded any remaining good faith toward the surrendering German forces. The total war mentality that Patton had championed was now fueled by a visceral moral outrage. The rules of war were not just broken, they were incinerated in the ovens of the Holocaust. The loss of trust mentioned in tactical reports was not merely about snipers, it was a fundamental rejection of the Nazi state as a civilized adversary. While Patton's drive was defined by aggression, his rivals on the northern flank were achieving their own miracles. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen by the First Army in March had provided the template for the speed Patton now emulated. The bridge's survival was a result of German technical failure and Hitler's own bureaucratic incompetence. The German inability to destroy the bridge, despite having 18 days to prepare, was a direct result of Hitler's orders prohibiting the early laying of charges. The capture allowed the Allies to establish a bridgehead across the Rhine 3 weeks ahead of schedule, preventing the Germans from regrouping. For Patton, Remagen was a challenge to be surpassed. He wanted to beat Field Marshal Montgomery in the race across the Rhine, not just for glory, but as a matter of personal as well as national pride. Using Monty's perceived dismissive attitude as motivation, Patton was out to prove that the Yanks were every bit as good as the Tommies. He ordered his engineers to cross the river silently, without artillery preparation, at Oppenheim. When his first troops touched the opposite bank, Patton famously crowed to General Bradley, "Tell the world we're across. I want the world to know that Third Army made it before Monty starts across." Yet as the war in Europe drew to a close, Patton found himself ill-equipped for the peace that followed. As the military governor of Bavaria, his aggressive stances toward the Soviet Union, whom he viewed as the next inevitable enemy, and his controversial views on denazification led to a cloud over his reputation. Patton's refusal to treat every member of the Nazi Party as a criminal, arguing that being a Nazi in Germany was like being a Democrat or Republican in America, ultimately led to his removal from command of the Third Army. Eisenhower, who had saved his old friend many times, saw little point in keeping him in a job he was clearly unsuited to hold. On December 9, 1945, the general who had survived the last bullet of 2 world wars met his end not on a battlefield, but on a quiet road near Mannheim. While traveling to a pheasant hunt, his Cadillac 75 staff car was struck by a 2.5-ton army truck that veered unexpectedly into his lane. The impact was not a high-speed collision. Neither vehicle was moving faster than 20 miles per hour, but it was enough to throw Patton forward, his head striking the metal frame of the partition between the front and rear seats. The result was a shattered third cervical vertebra and instant paralysis from the neck down. The general lay in a hospital bed in Heidelberg, a prisoner of his own body. As the journalists gathered outside and the army issued bulletins of a remarkable recovery, but the truth was far grimmer. The man who had conquered a continent was now fighting a battle he could not win. In the shadow of this tragic irony, rumors began to swirl. Was the accident truly an accident? Or had the old blood and guts finally become too dangerous for the post-war world he helped create? The man who had lived for the fire was now facing the cold silence of history. The silence of room 110 at the 131st Station Hospital in Heidelberg was a far cry from the roar of Patton's Third Army. Here, the man who had outpaced every general in Europe was reduced to watching the shadows of the Snowdrop Guards, named for their polished white helmets, dance across his white walls. But while the public was fed stories of his wartime speed recovery, Patton knew the truth. He chose to ask his doctor one question: "What chance have I to ride a horse again?" The answer was silence. But as the general lay immobile, the ghosts of his most controversial decisions began to haunt the Allied High Command. This was the story of the Hammelburg raid, a mission so secret, so personal, and so disastrous that it nearly destroyed Patton's reputation before the car crash ever could. March 26, 1945. While the Third Army was supposedly focused on the strategic objective of the main river, Patton was secretly obsessing over a map of a town called Hammelburg. 50 miles behind German lines lay Oflag, 13B, a prisoner of war camp. Patton had received intelligence that his son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel John Case Waters, who had been captured in Tunisia 2 years prior, was being held there. Without consulting General Bradley or the SHAEF staff, Patton ordered the formation of Task Force Baum. It was a mission born of family ties, executed with the reckless aggression that was Patton's trademark. But it was built on a foundation of logistical sand. He assigned the mission to Combat Command B of the 4th Armored Division, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who initially thought the mission risky and foolish. Captain Abraham Baum, a 24-year-old Jewish officer from the Bronx, was the man chosen to lead this mission. Baum was a battle-hardened veteran, but when he was given the orders to penetrate 80 kilometers into enemy territory with just 303 men and 57 vehicles, even he was skeptical. The task force was denied sufficient maps. They had only 15 for the entire column, and were forced to rely on questioning German civilians to find the camp. As they rumbled through the night, a German spotter plane shadowed them, a silent sentinel coordinating a response from every Wehrmacht and SS unit in the sector. The force consisted of Company A of the 10th Armored Infantry, 10 Sherman tanks, 5 light tanks, and 3 self-propelled assault guns. The drive to Hammelburg was a gauntlet of fire. In the town of Lohr, the task force lost its first Sherman tank to a roadblock. At Gemmenden, they encountered an unsuspecting German division that was rapidly alerted to their presence. The reconnaissance by fire tactics that Patton had championed were now used by the Germans against his own task force. The task force was diverted by blown bridges and forced into a detour that drained their precious fuel supplies. By the time Baum's tanks reached the fences of Oflag, 13BB, on the afternoon of March 27th, they were a battered remnant of the force that had set out. The detour to the north forced them to seek another crossing of the Sin River, further delaying their arrival. What they found at the camp was a logistical nightmare. Instead of the few hundred officers they expected to rescue, there were thousands of prisoners, including a large group of Serbians whose gray uniforms caused a tragic case of friendly fire as the Americans approached, as they were mistaken for German troops. In the confusion, Patton's son-in-law, John Waters, was shot in the groin by a German guard while trying to arrange a truce. The rescue had become a massacre. Baum quickly realized he could only take about 200 men back on his remaining vehicles. The rest were told to head west on foot, a death sentence in a territory crawling with irate German units. Colonel Paul Good, the senior American officer at the camp, advised that the walking wounded should head back to the Oflag to avoid slowing down the column. The withdrawal from Hammelburg was the disastrous outcome that Patton had feared. On the morning of March 28th, as Task Force Baum tried to break out from Hill 427, they were surrounded. The Germans had used a captured American tank to lure the column into an ambush, answering radio calls in English to sow confusion. Within minutes, the task force was annihilated. 32 men were killed, and nearly all the survivors, including Baum himself, were taken prisoner. All 57 vehicles were lost. Patton's reaction to the defeat was to classify the entire mission as top secret to prevent the press from learning that he had risked American lives for a personal motive. This classification suppressed internal discussion and kept the embarrassing details from the public eye for months. This failure was a crack in the armor of the Patton myth. It revealed a leader whose sixth sense for battle could be blinded by personal vendetta and arrogance. The Hammelburg raid became a whispered scandal in the halls of the Allied command, further alienating Patton from Eisenhower. It underscored the loss of trust that was beginning to define the end of the war. Not just trust between enemies, but trust between a general and the soldiers he commanded. The men of Task Force Baum felt they had been used as pawns in a private drama. Patton later defended the mission when details became public, but the damage to his standing with his superiors was irrevocable. As the Third Army continued its advance, the tactical aggression of reconnaissance by fire reached its peak. In towns like Hurl and Niederbrumbach, the 19th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron moved through streets bedecked with white flags. Yet they never stopped firing. The psychological toll on the American GI was immense. They had seen too many fake surrenders and too many bedsheet traps. The white flag had become a symbol of suspicion rather than safety. This erosion of the ethical threshold was a direct consequence of the German use of perfidy, but it resulted in the systematic destruction of urban centers. In many towns, the villagers were found bringing peace offerings of wine and champagne, even as the Americans entered with weapons hot, reflecting the absolute volatility of the environment. The discovery of the concentration camps served as a grim justification for this ruthlessness. When Patton ordered the citizens of Weimar to walk through Buchenwald, he was sending a message. There are no innocent bystanders in a regime of depravity. The shock of seeing the emaciated bodies at Ohrdruf and the death train at Dachau hardened the hearts of the men. For these soldiers, the reconnaissance by fire was no longer just a tactic. It was a moral reckoning. The German population was made to feel the full significance of war. As one American officer wrote, a stern atonement for the horrors they had allowed to exist. The exposure to these atrocities provided the moral context for the aggressive doctrine Patton had championed. But as the fighting stopped, the political war began. Patton, the man of action, was a disaster in the world of diplomacy. As the military governor of Bavaria, he refused to implement the harsh denazification orders from Washington. He saw the need for professional administrators to keep the water and power running, even if they had been Nazi Party members. His infamous press conference, where he compared Nazis to Democrats and Republicans, was the final straw for Eisenhower. Ike realized that Patton was a weapon that could not be sheathed. He was moved to the paper command of the 15th Army in October 1945, a repository for historians and disgraced officers. A move that left him feeling sacrificed for political expediency. This brings us back to the wintry road near Mannheim on December 9, 1945. The accidental nature of the collision has fueled conspiracy theories for 80 years. The driver of the 2.5-ton truck, Robert Thompson, was a young soldier who had been joyriding and was reportedly under the influence. He made a sudden, sharp turn into Patton's lane without signaling. Curiously, Thompson and his two passengers were quickly moved out of Germany to England, and no criminal charges were ever filed. The official investigation report went missing for decades, raising the question, was the truck a tool of a higher power? Historical investigations, such as Robert Wilcox's Target Patton, point to a possible collusion between the Soviet NKVD and the American OSS Patton had become a liability. He was publicly advocating for a preemptive strike against the Soviet Union, whom he called savages. He was threatening to unmuzzle himself and expose the incompetence and corruption of the Allied High Command during the war. In the high-stakes game of the early Cold War, a paralyzed Patton was safer for everyone than a Patton with a microphone. The idea that Patton was on a Soviet hit list was shared by Ukrainian nationalist leaders and counterintelligence corps agents like Steven Skubik. In his final days in Room 110, Patton was surrounded by snowdrop military police, supposedly to protect him from the press, but perhaps also to ensure he didn't say too much. Douglas Bazzata, a former OSS operative, later claimed he was asked by OSS Chief William Donovan to neutralize Patton. Bazzata suggested that when the car accident failed to kill the general, a refined form of cyanide was used in the hospital to trigger the pulmonary embolism that ultimately stopped his heart on December 21st. While impossible to prove, the lack of an autopsy and the vanishing of key witnesses have kept these theories alive for decades. Whether it was murder or a tragic irony of fate, Patton's death marked the end of an era. He was the last of the great warriors, a man who belonged to the age of the saber, but mastered the age of the tank. He was a man of profound contradictions, a liberator who could be brutal, a genius who could be foolish, and a leader who valued the lives of his men above all else, except perhaps his own glory. His wife Beatrice, who had endured a white-knuckle flight across the Atlantic to be at his side, was present when he finally succumbed to his injuries at 1745 on December 21st, 1945. The tactical legacy of Patton's Third Army, the married armor infantry formations, and the use of massive direct fire suppression remains the foundation of modern urban warfare doctrine. We see his influence in every conflict that involves clearing a city, but we also see the warning of 1945 that when trust disappears from the battlefield, the nature of war changes forever. The white flag controversy of April 1945 reminds us that the ethical boundaries of war are fragile, and once they are breached by perfidy, they are replaced by fire. Patton's grave, situated in front of his 5,070 soldiers in Luxembourg, remains a silent command post for the men who executed the most rapid advance in history. General George S. Patton Jr. wanted to be killed by the last bullet in the last battle of the last war. Instead, he died in a hospital bed, paralyzed by a fender bender. But perhaps his death was the only way the world could move from the total war of 1945 into the uneasy peace of the Cold War. He was a man built for the fire, and he could not survive the cooling of the ashes. As we look at the simple white cross in Luxembourg, we are forced to ask, did the world lose a hero in 1945, or did it lose a man who was ready to start World War III? In the final weeks of 1945, General Patton prioritized the lives of his soldiers over the traditional rules of surrender. Do you believe his use of reconnaissance by fire was a necessary military evolution, or did it set a dangerous precedent for future conflicts? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.